There we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 58th episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Um, I'm going to wind up changing things up a little. This is a series of videos I've been meaning to do actually pretty much since I started doing this show. And I've just felt with recent events now is the time to do it. What we're going to do tonight and then over the next several weeks is look at the major religions of the world. At the moment, the list I'm looking at is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. I'll probably add to that. My current plan is to pair the religions up somewhat topically. Christianity and Judaism will be an episode. Hinduism and Buddhism will be an episode. Islam is going to be part of tonight and I'll get into that in a second. But and then I'm not sure what I'm going to pair Taoism with. I may get into Confucianism or Shinto or just a broader overlook at some of the other religions that are out there that aren't as big. I mean, in terms of membership, the big five are the big five for a reason. But there's a number of important religions out there that maybe not have the huge numbers, but people that aren't as familiar with, like the Sikh faith. Actually, I probably would get into the Sikh faith towards the end as well, if only because people tend to confuse them with Muslims. Um, but that won't be part of this episode, mostly because I'm actually not that familiar with the Sikh religion. And I took the time to do some research about Islam, and I've done research in the past about the other religions I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to do refreshers as I get to each one. So I want to be informed, and I want to give people accurate information on what I'm talking about. So some things are going to take longer than others just so I can present them properly. My current plan is that tonight I'm going to start, which is where we are now. I'm going to explain why I'm doing this. I'm going to talk about religion as a concept, the history of religion, how we get the religions of today, what religion I think is probably the oldest in man's practices, etc. And then we're going to get into Islam. And then next week will be Christianity, Judaism, and then Buddhism and Hinduism, and then Taoism and whatever I pair it with. And then, or I may just do Taoism and then some closing, Taoism, the minor religions and closing thoughts. Let's be real clear on something. I've never made a secret of the fact I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. And I'm going to talk about my own faith when I get into my episode on Christianity. I am not here to judge people. I am not here to put moral moral evaluations on these religions. That's not the point of what I'm doing. My point here is to educate people. Ever since I was in high school, I had a really wonderful teacher back in high school, my world cultures teacher in 10th grade. Keep in mind I'm 40, so we're talking about some time ago, by the name of Mrs. Emig. And Mrs. Emig introduced me to the world of the various world religions, and I found it fascinating. And when I went to college, I found it even more fascinating. I took more courses in religion. I actually, before I dropped out because of my own mistakes, was seriously considering doing a dual major in religion. This is a subject I'm fascinated by. It's a subject I'm passionate about, and it's a subject people don't understand in my experience. And the thing is, when you particularly look at in the United States, when you look at Judaism and Islam, and to some extent Christianity as well, a lot of people don't understand it, and that lack of understanding brings fear. And when I say that about Christianity, I'm not just talking about non-Christians towards Christians, but within Christianity itself. The various sects of Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, the Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses have a long history of not understanding each other's beliefs and fighting sometimes violently about it. And a lot of the time, I think this is really grounded in ignorance, and fear leads, to borrow from Yoda, fear leads to hatred. And ignorance, so if I can go one further from what Yoda said, ignorance leads to fear leads to hatred. Fear is the source of a lot of problems in the world, and a lack of understanding, I think, is part of that. That's why I'm doing this, is to try to educate people. And that's why I'm also starting with Islam, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about Muslims and about their faith. And it's a very interesting religion, and as a religious whole, it gets a bad rap. We're going to talk. I mean, I'm not going to shy. I will say I'm not going to shy away from the darker sides of the religions we're talking about. I'm going to going to be talking about crusades and witch hunts when I talk about Christianity. I'm going to be talking about ISIS and Al Qaeda and the historical invasions of Europe by the Muslims tonight. But I'm not trying to judge these religions. I'm trying to present as balanced a view as as an outsider can. If anyone winds up watching this who is a member of any of the faiths I talk about and is offended by my presentation, let me apologize now. That is not my intent. It is not my intention to be offensive. It is not my intention to be rude. It is my intention to try to do this in an objective and fair manner. Personally, I think many of these religions, and yes, I include Islam, get an unfairly bad rap. And I'm trying to dispel that. If I get something wrong, please put it in the comments. I'll bring it up in a later episode. Or if you're in the chat now and I get something wrong, call me on it. And I can address it right here on the air. But that's why I'm doing this. So let's talk, before I get into Islam and start this road down all the various religious faiths, let's talk a little bit about what religion is, what the word religion means, what is and isn't a religion, what is and isn't a cult. We've talked a little bit about the nature of cults. I'm going to touch on the difference, or really the lack thereof, between a religion and a cult, and a little bit of the history of religion as a concept. We have no way. Let's start, I think, at the beginning, with the beginning of religion. We have no idea where religion begins. How far does it go back? Certainly before recorded history. There are cave paintings from various, from Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, and early primitive Homo races that suggest religious aspects. Pictures of people that can shapeshift. We've found Neanderthal graves, for example, that show signs of being buried with a degree of ritual, being buried with the weapons of their enemy, with weapons and things of that nature, maybe the weapons of their enemies, suggesting that the idea of the concept of religion may in fact predate Homo sapiens as a species. I don't know. The usual school of thought about the way that religions began has gone, and I disagree with this, and I'm going to get into why in a minute, at least in anthropology, is that religion started out as polytheism. Oh wait, before I get into this, let me get into the definition of terms here. I want to clarify some things out. Yeah, certainly, I would agree. Anthropology possibly needs to be more popular, but let's clear up some terms just for the sake of clarity. So when I say polytheism, it's the worship of multiple deities. There's similar to polytheism. There's a related concept which is henotheism. Now, in polytheism, when you're talking about polytheism, you have the Greek pantheon. You have Zeus and Ares and Artemis and all of the other gods the Greeks worshipped, and then of course the Romans picked them up later. In henotheism, you have the god of your tribe. If you're a Jew, for example, you have Yahweh. If you're a Canaanite, you have Moloch. If you're a Babylonian, maybe you worship Marduk. But each tribe, you believe that you have one God that watches over your tribe. You worship that God. You praise that God. You make offerings to that God. It's not that you don't believe in or necessarily acknowledge the existence of other gods. It's that This God is the God of my people, so I worship him. I do not worship Moloch or the other ones because I'm not a Canaanite. I don't worship the Canaanite God. He doesn't protect me, he protects them. My God protects me. Um, and this ties greatly into some of my opinion about the way that religion's formed, and we'll get into that. Then, of course, there's monotheism. Monotheism is there is one God. The three biggest examples of monotheism in the world, of course, are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They are not by any means the only forms of monotheism practiced in the world. Closely related to monotheism, in fact, some early sects of Christianity and some of these other religions, actually more properly qualified as this, is dualism. Specifically, the early Gnostic sect within Christianity was dualist. And there are some aspects of Judaism that's dualist. In a dualist mindset, you have two gods. You have a god of light and a god of darkness, good and evil. In early Gnosticism, there was the idea that the God of the Old Testament had created the physical world, where the God of the New Testament created the spiritual world. So the God of the Old Testament was considered evil and referred to as Rex Mundi, whereas the God of the New Testament was good. In Zoroastrianism, which predates Christianity and was the main religion of Persia, Zoroastrian priests were actually the Magi that wound up coming to Christ. There was a belief that you had Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Ahura Mazda being good, Ahriman being evil. Here's where this is different from mainstream Christianity. In mainstream Christianity, you have God and Jesus, who are all powerful, and Satan, who is not God. He is nowhere in mainstream Christianity is nowhere near the level of God. In a dualistic mindset, Satan is a god equal to God. They're the same. They're just morally opposed to each other. And actually, Zoroastrianism is very interesting just because it has a number of concepts very similar to Christianity, where you have these two opposing forces, and then they each have servants, similar to the idea of angels and demons, although not exactly identical. So that's dualism. Deism is another interesting one. There's some evidence Einstein may have been a deist. Thomas Jefferson was definitely a deist, as was Benjamin Franklin. Deists is sometimes called the watchmaker hypothesis. It's this idea that there was a God, there is a creator. The creator created the universe and stepped back and now lets it run. This is different from more traditional theism like Christianity and Judaism, because where in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, God still actively takes a role in human affairs. A deistic God is an observer. He's watching what happens. It's an interesting concept, but it's obviously very different than my own faith. And to my knowledge, there isn't really an organized form of deism. It's more of an individualistic interpretation of theology. So another very interesting one that doesn't get a lot of discussion sometimes is what's called pantheism. When we get into Hinduism in a couple of weeks, Hinduism in some forms and aspects can be pantheistic, can also be monotheistic, can also be polytheistic. It's all dependent on interpretation. But in pantheism, God is in everything. Everything is God. We are all inherently divine. All of nature is inherently divine. Everything is not simply everything has a soul. We're going to get into what that is in a minute, but everything is part of God. Last but not least, not last but not least, there are more to go. But another major one is the concept. Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Animism. Animism. Animism is one of, if not the oldest forms of religion. And it's, in its simplest terms, it's a personification of nature. Everything has a soul. Rocks, trees, animals, plants, humans, mountains, streams, rivers. Everything has a soul. Everything has a spirit, and it's worship and veneration of the spirit. Shinto and other traditional Eastern religions, the ones that predate Hinduism, even but aren't nearly as organized or widespread. More accurately, they've since influenced later Eastern thought. Tends to be animistic. The idea that rivers have a dragon. There's elements of Hinduism in some of animism, and some Greek thought, and the idea that you had these dryads and these nymphs and these other lesser divinities that watch over trees and rivers and lakes. Some of the native American tribes can be animistic, but realistically, they run the gambit of religious variety. And for that matter, Voodoo and Santeria and the other Afro-Caribbean religions are frequently animistic. But it's more complicated than that because they also acknowledge deities. But animism is usually found in tribal cultures. It's not as common in more developed societies, although elements of it do influence the bigger societies and the bigger religions to varying degrees. Two of the other major ones is atheism, of course, which is specifically the disbelief or lack of belief in a deity. Specifically, atheists get annoyed when I say this, but I specifically would define atheism as the belief that God does not exist. And then more common in my experience than atheism is actually more accurately what's describable as agnosticism. And agnostic says, I don't know. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. It's literally it means not knowing. There's also a related belief that's reasonably common that gets labeled agnosticism, which isn't quite accurate, but I don't know a better word for it, which is the belief that there is something out there. They're just not sure about what, or whether it's personal or impersonal. One of the other things you'll find very interesting, and what divides Eastern religion and many Eastern religions and Western religions, as you'll see as this series of episodes progresses, is the idea of a personal deity versus an impersonal deity. A personal deity is the one that most Westerners think of when you talk about God or gods. It's someone with a recognizable human-like personality that you can have a conversation with. God the Father, Jesus, Allah, Yahweh, the various Greek, Norse pantheons. They have an identity. They have a personality. They are someone you can actually speak to and reasonably expect that they can grasp what you're saying, and at least hypothetically could speak back. And in some religions, in fact, they do, which gets into the concept of mysticism, which we'll be talking about later when I get into the Sufi movement within Islam, and for that matter, Christian mysticism and Jewish mysticism. But again, an impersonal deity is more of a force of nature. It is supernatural. It is divine. But it's so much greater and more complex and more fundamental to the inner workings of the universe that you can't. It doesn't have a recognizable personality. It's not actually something you can reasonably manage in conversing with. The classic example of this would be the Tao in Taoism. The first line of the Tao Te Ching the central holy text of Taoism is the Tao that is Tao is not true Tao, which more accurately would translate as the Tao that you that can be spoken of is not really Tao, because the moment you try to describe it, you're already wrong. It's just too complicated of a concept. No, Serenity, that's actually a really good question, but she asks, so it would be more like looking at the North Wind or Jack Frost. Even the North Wind to a point, but Jack Frost is still a degree of anthropomorphizing. Anthropomorphizing, for any of my listeners who don't know, and I think most of you probably do, because as I've said many times, in my experience, most of my listeners are very intelligent people, but is attributing a personality and human-like characteristics to the inanimate or a force of nature. The Man in the Moon, seeing the idea that the sun has a personality, the idea, things of that. It's things of that nature. It's making thinking animals can actually talk and communicate and interact. It relates more to animism, hence similarity of name, but it's not really an impersonal deity, because again, in something like Jack Frost, there is at least an idea of a being. Here, it's something that transcends language. It's usually a very concept for Westerners to wrap their heads around. And I've had professors in college that suggested that may be inherent to language, just because our language is most Western language is very literal, or is very not literal. That's actually not the exact opposite of the word I'm looking for. Abstract. We have letters. Letters combine to have words. Words have definitions and have meanings. Whereas in Japanese or Chinese language, you have the kanji and the other written language forms, in which there is at least a symbolic representation of what the word is. And it was thought that because it was this more symbolic language, it was easier they were more able to represent it than our language of letters and words. I honestly have no idea. I will say it is definitely a very complicated concept to wrap your head around. It's more like believing God is out there. God is part of the working of the universe. So it often lends itself into pantheism, where God is in all things. But again, it's the idea of a God that is a part of nature and is something inherently unknowable and infinite, and not something. Again, it's not something. An impersonal deity is not something you can have a conversation with, or a personal deity you at least hypothetically could. And I've probably bungled that explanation. I'll probably try to revisit when I get into Taoism and Hinduism, where it's a little bit more. It's a little easier, I think, to explain when I'm talking about the Brahma or the Tao, because those lend themselves more to impersonal deities than personal ones. But again, complications of the nature of Hinduism and the fact it has both. Trying to think if there's anything remotely like it in Western concepts. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But to get back on topic. So where does religion? So what is a religion? We're going to spend all this time talking about religion. Everybody talks about religion. People fight wars over religion. What is a religion anyway? Here's the funny thing about that. It's very hard to get anyone to agree. it's hard to think of a religion that encompasses everything that's considered religion. Looking it up online, you get the belief in worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. Particular system of faith or worship, a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. Okay, let's see what Wikipedia says, just for the Wikipedia defines it as a religion is a cultural system of behaviors and practices, worldviews, sacred texts, holy places, ethics, and societal organization that relate to humanity to what anthropologists called an order of existence. So here's why it's hard to define what religion is. When most people think of religion, when most Westerners, particularly Americans, think of religion, we tend to think of Western religion, the worship of God or gods. But what about Buddhism? In Buddhism, as we'll see, there are sects of Buddhism that worship gods. There are sects of Buddhism, of course, that worship Buddha. But you can also be a practicing Buddhist without any belief in a deity. And you can be a practicing Buddhist without, and actually, essentially, be atheistic and materialistic without a belief in supernatural forces. Which then is where you start blurring the line between religion and philosophy. If you want another example that really messes with the heads of scholars that study religion as a cultural phenomenon, communism. Now, communism is militantly atheistic. They do not believe in God, in organized religion, and they are generally violently opposed to it. They don't believe, officially speaking, communists don't believe in God. But in behavior, they behave very similarly to religion, to other religious groups. There are also cults various groups that are defined as cults that exist that are in fact atheistic in origin. One of the most workable definitions I've ever seen of religion, which I saw in college, is to call religion the contemplation of the other. What is the other? It's something greater than it's something greater, or it's something else. It could be God, it could be a greater power, it could be a greater force. It is something beyond yourself. Is it a perfect definition? No. Serenity has an interesting definition in a subscription to a philosophy that has a major impact on daily life. That's not a bad definition. But the way I personally tend to see religion is a focus on something, on a metaphysical, spiritual, or at least philosophical concept greater than yourself. Usually, this is a spiritual concept. It's a god. It's some sort of spiritual force, but not necessarily. It's a philosophical ideal. It can be a philosophical ideal or goal, but it's a devotion to that. Communism can sort of fit this definition because there is, while it doesn't believe in a supernatural force, there is a great deal of devotion to a higher principle than the self. The idea of working towards the common good. And I think the difference between religion and just ordinary interest in such matters is a question of devotion and dedication. but that's about as close as I can get. There are plenty of people in the world that disagree with me. There are plenty of people that will open up a dictionary and read one of the definitions I gave earlier and go, "That's religion." But the thing with most definitions is most of them concern themselves with what religions do more than what religions are. They'll talk about ritual, they'll talk about systems of beliefs, they'll talk about holy texts. And the thing is, just about everything you can list that you think of as being part of a religion, there's almost certainly some group out there that considers itself a religion, is considered by other people a religion, that doesn't fit into your neat little definition. It isn't a concept that can be simply defined. As I've said before when I've discussed cults, this is also something you run into with cults, where cults are not something you can't easily define the difference between a cult and a religion. Most religions behave very similar to cults when they first get founded, and sometimes at other points in their history. And cults there are examples of things that at one time were definitely considered cults that are now have gone mainstream. But okay, let's talk before I get into Islam. I'm trying to do that towards the end of the first hour, just to give it time, although I may get started sooner. Let's look a little bit about how religions form. This is a question that has been bugging the heck out of scholars for millennia. There's lots of theories about, you'll hear atheists say that everyone's born atheism, that we learn religion. You'll hear Christians say that everyone is born with inborn need for God. From the studies I've read, and in my personal opinion, people have an inherent need to believe in something greater than themselves. Religion isn't the only way people fill that need, but the need is there. I think that's the most basic purpose religion serves. I think another related purpose that religion serves in people's lives, and why I think religion as a concept, despite what some atheists believe, is actually good for humanity, is it fills an inherent need in people's lives that science can't. Religion's not the only, and I'm not saying that religion is the only way to fill that hole, but there are certain questions science not only doesn't answer, but is never meant to even address. And I don't mean questions of the origin of the species or that. I mean, why are we here? What purpose does our life have? Does the universe, is there something greater than us out there in the universe that cares? In a metaphysical sense. Why, these are questions you can't really answer in a scientific sense. There are atheists that have their own answers to these questions, sometimes simply being that life is inherently meaningless. Some have other answers to it. But those answers come from philosophy. They don't come from objective, hard, evidence-based science. For many people, religion serves this role. I'm not saying that religion is a better solution to these questions than philosophy. I'm not saying philosophy is a better answer than religion. I'm just saying, for some people, this is what works. For other people, other things are a better answer. There are other purposes that religion certainly serves. There's giving people a sense of community, giving people a sense of history, giving us people cultural context, helping people deal with the greater problems of life, like the fact that inevitably one day we will all die. And for some people, this religion is the best answer for them. Again, if this isn't what works for you, I am certainly not saying that atheists are horrible, evil people. You'll notice at no point in any of this have I brought up morality and ethics. Although certainly that's another purpose that for some people religion can serve, is refining. And for many of us, I would say, even people who eventually move from religion to atheism, religion often serves as a starting framework for ethics and morality. But the important thing to realize there is it's not the only frame. There are other frameworks out there that are based in philosophy and other concepts that don't require a religious background. And there are people that are raised atheists that are still moral, ethical people. I am not saying that religious people are more or less ethical than atheists. I'm just saying for some people it forms the beginning of their framework. And I think the truth you'll find is most religious people expand beyond that initial framework, whether they stay religious or not. But these are some of the roles that religion serves. I personally think spiritually speaking, I think religion started when the divine contacted man. What form that contact took, I'm inclined. I'm Christian. I tend to think in terms of the Bible. But I think even before that, there's an inherent need for something, which really, if the divine had never contacted man, I think man would eventually have invented religion just because of the social and psychological purposes that it serves. Now, the majority of anthropologists and other people that study religion tend to think that religion started as animistic, and then eventually, as time and society developed into polytheism, which eventually becomes henotheism, which becomes monotheism. And then, of course, atheists will argue that monotheism inevitably leads to atheism. I don't agree. I think, yeah, it probably started with animism. I think over time, what you got was actually probably closer to the earliest stages being monotheistic. Or you start to have this concept of you have an animism where all things have a spirit. And then you start developing this idea of, well, your tribe has a chieftain, your nation has a king. The spirits must have a chief being. And so where you have this concept similar to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, where you have a single ruling deity and lesser attending spirits. Some of those spirits are probably still worshipped, and it may have been a mix between early religion was probably a mix between animism and monotheism and small forms of polytheism. Over time, what happens is each of these societies interact with each other, and so you have tribe A who worships. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say you have tribe A that worships Athena. You have tribe B that worships worships Zeus. Tribe A and tribe B go to war. Tribe B, the ones that worship Zeus, win. Now, you have this idea that, well, Athena is our god. Why did we lose? Well, their god is greater. You start to get into henotheism, and then eventually you start to get into, as the societies continue to interact and continue to mingle, you start to get into ideas of pantheons, and you have this idea of, well, Zeus is the chief of the gods, Athena's his daughter, and as more cultures interact and go to war with each other, they adopt each other's gods further and further and further. And we know this is true to a point with polytheism, and actually to some extent with monotheism, that when you look at pantheons, over time, polytheistic cultures tend to adopt deities of cultures they interact with. In Hinduism, for example, there are Hindus that worship Ganesh and Shiva and Vishnu and the other gods of Hinduism, and at the same time acknowledge Jesus Christ. And they see no conflict in doing so. There are other polytheists throughout history that have done this. There's some very complex and interesting ideas you find in ancient Romanian folklore, where there was the original god of Romania, who was a pagan god, and then Yahweh, the god of the Old Testament, came along, devoured the original one supreme god of Romania, and became the one supreme god of the universe. And then Jesus comes along, devours Yahweh, and now he's the one supreme god of the universe. Which is a very strange way of looking at it. But you have these kinds of concepts. But that's my thought. I have no idea if it's right. Nobody really we're talking about something that's developed over millennia and goes long back before any recorded history. We have absolutely no way of knowing for certain. Again, we do know that cultures tend to adopt each other's gods in one way, shape, or form. Christianity is particularly well known for turning various pagan deities into demons in their theology, which is true. And on the other hand, Christianity has also turned some of the pagan gods into saints. Saint Christopher, Bridget, and Saint Bridget are both probably originally pagan deities that were adopted. And while Christianity gets all the credit for this, everybody does it. Every other religion has been doing this since the dawn of time. You find one example in Hinduism. There are beings called the Shuras and Devas. I'm forgetting, but I'll look it up when I talk about Hinduism. But one of them is basically equivalent to angels. The other is demons. In Zoroastrianism, you also have Ashuras and Devas, but the roles are flipped. Right, in Zoroastrianism, there we go, I just remembered. In Zoroastrianism, Devas are malevolent and demonic, and Ashuras are divine and angelic, whereas in Hinduism, Devas are divine and angelic, where Ashuras are evil and malevolent. You have these kinds of roles, and you have people that various tribes and cultures worshipped as gods, that other tribes and cultures saw as demons, and gods that have been adopted back and forth. I mean, Rome is, of course, very famous for the fact that it basically took all the Greek gods, changed the names and some of the details, and just worshipped them. And added some of their own. And this has been going on for a very long time. But okay, that is a fairly good, very broad look at religion as a concept. I am going to take a quick break while I bring up some of my research material, and then we're going to start getting into Islam. Now, let's be clear about, Islam is incredibly unpopular. There is a reason I'm starting with Islam. At least it's unpopular in the United States. And yeah, there are aspects of Islam that are not great. And there are aspects of Islam that aren't as terrible as people think. And some of the aspects are more, almost all of it is more complicated than people think. But, okay, so Islam, for those of you who don't know, is one of the biggest religions in the world. It has over 1 billion followers. It's based on the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, which he received the revelations during the 7th century, specifically in what is now Saudi Arabia. Islam is, and this is one of the crucial concepts I think to realize with Islam. Islam is extremely monotheistic. In fact, it is more monotheistic than Christianity. There is one God, there is only one God, and the idea that God could be triune like in Christianity, according to Islam, is incorrect. which isn't to say they don't venerate Jesus Christ. We're going to get into that, but in point of fact that they do. But at any rate, getting back to the original origins of Islam, the Archangel Jibril, which is the Islamic form of Gabriel, appears to Muhammad in Saudi Arabia, near Mecca, not in Mecca itself. Muhammad was born in Mecca, and there is a structure in Mecca that is the holiest site in the world. This is what Muslims worship to, and we're going to get into that when we get into the 5 pillars. But that's older than Islam, and they believe it actually ties back into Abraham. But anyway, over the course of 20 years, Gabriel dictates the book that we eventually would come to know as the Qu'ran. In Islam, the Quran is the literal direct word of God. It is not an interpretation. It is not a divine inspiration, the way the Bible is generally seen as. It is not something a prophet wrote after being given visions by God. This was directly dictated by an angel to man. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Islam, and I find quite interesting, is its view of Christianity and Judaism is actually very similar to Christianity's view of Judaism, which is they see the people of the book, which is the term that the Quran uses to refer to Christians and Jews, as worshippers of Allah. They believe in there have been 5 prophets, and every prophet they recognize, except Muhammad, is also recognized by Christians. Every prophet that they recognize, for that matter, except for Jesus and Muhammad, are also recognized by the Jews. They are Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, called Isa, and then the final prophet is Muhammad. Muhammad is the last prophet. He brought the final complete message of God. And Muslims, generally speaking, believe that the other texts, the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, have become corrupted by man, and that the only true, perfect writing of God's word is the Quran. That being said, in general, traditional Islam is actually much more forgiving of other forms of monotheism than it is polytheism, because they believe Jews and Christians are worshiping Allah just as they are. And it's worth noting as well that the term Allah gets misunderstood constantly. People think it's a pagan deity, it's a moon god. The word Allah from Arabic means the God. If you go to a Christian church in an Arabic country where the priests are all speaking in Arabic, they don't call God God, they call God Allah. It's the Arabic word for God. That is all it is. Along with this, to continue with talking about the meaning of some of these words, the word Islam itself in Muslim means submission. The central idea in this religion is submission to Allah. And their practices center around what they call the 5 pillars of Islam. These are what's considered the 5 most important practices Muslims get, every Muslim is expected to partake in, as long as it is within their ability to do so. These 5 are called faith, and I'm going to list them and I'm going to get into them. Hold on, I am referring directly to research material, because I want to make sure I get this as correct as I possibly can. So you have faith, prayer, fasting, the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca, and almsgiving. There is some debate that jihad becomes is a sixth pillar, but in the Quran and in most of mainstream Islam, it is not. There are five central practices to Islam, which are what I just listed. Now, the first of them, and the most fundamental, in fact, the thing, saying it with faith is what makes a person a Muslim. Is there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. This is a central concept to Islam. It is the central concept of Islam. It is that there is only one God, and Muhammad was his prophet. Saying this is a central part of their belief. It's a central part of what they do. From which you also have, of course, the idea of prayer. Now, this is again a very well-known concept of Islam. People, you see it in movies, you see it in TV shows. If you know anyone Muslim, you may have seen it in your general life, which is 5 times a day. They're expected to pray at dawn, midday, afternoon, sunset, and evening. It's always in the direction of the Kaaba shrine, which is in Mecca. It's the thing I was talking about that's believed to go back to Abraham, and usually done on a prayer mat. It's not something you have to do in a group. It is something you can do individually, although it's believed that there is value in doing it in a group. The famous sound that you'll hear from mosques, Islamic temples, is the call to prayer at these times. According to one of the sources I have, apparently the focal prayer of the week is the midday prayer at the mosque that happens on Fridays. Almsgiving is another central concept in Islam. The Quran itself, in 960s, explicitly requires it, and puts it up there with prayer and discussion of the duties of a Muslim. Perform the prayer and give the alms, 243, 110, 277. Another one that's probably fairly well known is fasting, specifically during Ramadan, known as Swam. And forgive me if I do not speak Arabic, so if I am butchering pronunciations, I again apologize. Swam is fasting. It is in commemoration of the revelation of the Quran. It's during the 9th month of the Islamic year. All adult Muslims are required to avoid food, drink, and sexual intercourse during the day. There are explicit exceptions made to this. Not travelers, soldiers, menstruating women, and the ill are exempted from the requirement of fasting, although they're expected to fast when they are able to do so. And the last is that there are every Muslim is expected to take the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca, the sacred city of Islam. It's considered that a visit is good at any time of the year, but again, specifically, this is supposed to be done during the last month of their year to fulfill the requirements of the Hajj. These are the 5 central tenets of the religion. You'll notice that in these 5 central tenets, there's nothing inherently violent, despite what people tend to think. And these are the basic foundations of Islam. There are, of course, other concepts to get into that we will be getting into with the concept of jihad, which is actually a really interesting concept when you get into what it's supposed to mean as opposed to the way that it gets interpreted. Actually, in point of fact, because of the significance of jihad, let me talk a little bit about what jihad is and what jihad means. Jihad as I understand it, jihad translates most directly as struggle. This can and at times does mean war, but most Islamic scholars, and I will provide. Let me be clear. I'm going to provide links in the description below once I'm done with this video to sources, so you can look this all up and see for yourself instead of taking my word for it. But there is 2 types. multiple types actually of jihad, but there's high jihad, and then there's the lesser jihad. The high jihad, the greatest of jihads, the most important of jihads, is internal. It's not the struggle against others, it's the struggle against the self. It's the effort to be a person of faith. It's the struggle against human nature. That is the central, most important in both Sunni and Shia, and I'll get into the difference as well. The central and most important aspect of jihad is the struggle of the self. There is also the external struggle, not all of which is violent. This is another thing people misunderstand, is preaching the word of Allah is considered a form of jihad as well. Standing up for your faith, talking about what you believe in, is considered central without the aspect of violence. In point of fact, well, there's no denying that Muslims throughout history have gotten into violent acts. And at times, forcible conversion. There is a verse in the Qu'ran. Let me look it up because I want to get the right one. Here we go. The Quran states there is no compulsion in religion. The path of guidance stands out clear from error. 256 and 6080. And this is specifically trying to say that no, there isn't supposed to be compulsion. You are not supposed to convert people out by the sword. This doesn't mean it didn't happen, but there is an actual stipulation in the Quran itself against violent conversion. Historically speaking, they have generally been more lenient towards the other two monotheistic faiths than towards polytheism on this matter. But that also depends on the time of history you're talking about, the branch of Islam you're talking about, and a whole series of other factors. The thing to realize is you're not dealing with a simple concept. If you read various Islamic scholars on the subject, even when you can declare, there are provisions for declaring war as jihad. What people think of as holy war. According to most scholars, a true jihad, in terms of a physical conflict, is fairly strict. It's supposed to be done primarily as a fight against oppression and tyranny, or in self-defense. Or another example that some scholars allow for is that if someone else violates a treaty. A really key point to all of this, and this is again, it is not a concept that Muslims have historically always followed, but a key point to this in a lot of the scholars of Sharia law and the scholars of Islamic teachings on the subject, it's only supposed to last as long as the original factor that caused it lasts. You fight in defense of your people, which is a pretty reasonable thing to do in my opinion, and I think most other people's opinion. If people stop invading you and stop attacking, the war is over. If you're fighting an oppressive regime and you topple the regime, you don't go on and kill everybody there. You don't do all of the, if the treaty that was being violated, if they go back to honoring their treaty, you don't keep slaughtering them. It's the idea. It's generally supposed to be the idea of the use of necessary force to the extent that it is necessary. It's not it is not meant to be retributive, and also quite significantly, aside from not being retributive, there is an important concept here is the concept of forgiveness. Now again, certainly when you look at the history of the Turks and the Ottomans and their invasions of Europe, did they follow it perfectly? Not so much. But when you're talking about the concept itself, it's not as black and white as Islam encourages its believers to go out and kill people. Another central concept, one of the things you run into is when people talk about Islam, they tend to think of just Islam all as a single giant religion. It's not that simple. There are a number of sects, the two largest and the two most significant being the Sunni and the Shiite. That have a fundamental split and have been fighting with each other about their interpretations of their religion longer and more seriously than they fight with non-Muslims. Now, the largest of the two sects is the Shia sect. The Shiites. If you hear Sunnis and Shiites, this is the Shiites. The split between the two branches happened when Muhammad died. Or more accurately, as I understand it, he ascended to heaven from the Dome of the Rock, which is the second holiest site in the world to Islam, which is in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And I'll get into that a little in time. But basically, the difference was that his followers were faced with the decision of who would succeed, would be the successor to Muhammad. The Shiites followed Ali, who was the closest relative to Muhammad, as his successor. There's somewhere around 120 million of them in the world. They have one major school of thought, the Jafariya, or the Twelvers, and a couple of others, the Seveners, Fivers, a couple other schools of thought. But this is the biggest sect. The other major sect would, of course, be the Sunni, which is about 940 million out of the 1.1 billion Muslims in the world. They're the largest sect. Shia is the smaller. Shia Muslims is about 10% of the worldwide Muslim population. Sunnis, or sometimes known as Sunnites, and they sometimes call themselves Al-Sunnah wal Jannah, adherents to the Sunnah and the Assembly. Sunnis their roots are in the followers of Abu Bakr, who was an effective leader and they saw as the successor of Muhammad, instead of his cousin and son-in-law, which would be the one that started the Shiites. To give you an idea, Algeria is nearly 99% Sunni, and Sunni Islam is the state religion. Kuwait is about 70%. Afghanistan is about 80%. Sunnis outnumber Shiites in Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Sudan, Syria, Tajikistan, Libya, Jordan, and certain islands in the Maldives, Comoros, and Cocos Islands. Iraq, on the other hand, is only about 45 to 60% Sunni, and they are concentrated primarily in the central northern parts of the country. Sunni Muslims are smaller minorities, about 10% in Iran and 30% in Bahrain. But whereas, like I said, there's the one major school. There are four schools of law in Sunni Islam: Hanafi, Maliki, and Shafi, and Hanbali. Now, I'm quite certain I am bungling these pronunciations, which I apologize for. These are the two major sects of Islam. When you're looking at Sharia, which is the body of Islamic law, which is a combination of interpretations of the Quran the and various other texts dealing with the life of Muhammad. And so you can't just go, well, oh, because whenever people in the U.S. talk about banning Sharia law and things like that, they tend to think of it as a unified whole, and it's really not. It's an incredible. I've done a little bit of research into it to the best of my ability, and the thing I'm eventually left with is it's too complicated to cover by itself. And I'm going to leave a link to Harvard Law's webpage about it to try and get people more familiar with it. But there isn't a single interpretation of the whole thing. There isn't even concepts that are everyone thinks of, like the prohibitions against homosexuality. How homosexuals are supposed to be treated can vary widely depending on which school of thought within Sharia law you're talking about. There's even some debate about the use among prominent scholars about the use of capital punishment at all, or capital punishment particularly in the case of what's the word I'm looking for? In the case of infidelity, with the whole idea of women being stoned for being rape victims, which does unfortunately happen. I'm not going to try and pretend it doesn't. But whether that's even legitimate, whether that's legitimate anymore, whether the conditions that the law requires for a person to be stoned to death for adultery, that's the word I've been trying to think of, are even possible in the modern world. But again, it's the law. Islamic law is a very complicated subject. There's a reason Harvard and other places are devoting time to trying to study and understand it. And certainly I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. I guess Sharia law, excuse me, is a good segue at this point. How it's practiced, because there's this whole idea we need to ban Sharia law in the United States. There are aspects of it I'm not a fan of, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Particularly when you look at how it's handled in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most, and let's be clear, among the Islamic nations and their handling of Sharia law, Saudi Arabia is one of the strictest. The Saudi Arabia constitution is the Quran. They take their religious laws extremely seriously. When you hear about state-sponsored beheading of people, when you hear about stoning, which isn't as common anymore as beheading, although it'd be a lie to say it never happens. A lot of the times you're looking at, when it's happening from the state as opposed to individuals, you're looking at Saudi Arabia. And there are other countries do this too. But there's also other countries that only adopt some aspects of Sharia law. There are some, here's an interesting one. If you want to talk about how very different some almost highly Islamic countries handle Sharia law, look at Turkey. Turkish law does not include Sharia law in their legal system. It explicitly separates it. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for the treatment of women in some of the more extreme cases. Granted, when you get into things like women being expected to wear hijabs and burqas, I'm not a fan of the idea of requiring them, but there are also women that choose to wear them, and people are entitled. Let people wear what they want. But in particular, I found something I personally find really fascinating. I want to comment on when people talk about banning the application of Sharia law in the United States. The thing is, you're too late. First of all, in terms of criminal enforcement of religious law, that's already banned in the United States. But it's called the U.S. Constitution, First Amendment. Congress is explicitly prohibited from enforcing religious laws. Has been since the founding fathers. We don't need to cover that. On the other hand, there is actually a law that was passed by Congress that allows Sharia law in very specific instances. And I don't think a lot of the people who oppose Sharia law in the United States want to overturn that law. Because this doesn't apply to criminal court cases. It applies to civil court cases. Let me look up and get the exact one. Looking. Again, I have the desire to get this as accurate as possible. I want to get the actual name. Okay, I'm going to waste more time than I want to trying to hunt down the exact name, but I'll try and look it up later and put it and add it to the description. Wait. Basically, there is a law that was passed by Congress, and I want to say the 1980s, that explicitly allows in a civil court case. So more specifically, when you're talking about trying to resolve a will, divorce, things of that nature, what it comes down to here is that if all the parties involved, for example, agree, or especially if all of them are Muslims, are very likely to agree, they can choose to go to a religious mediator to resolve the dispute. And this doesn't just apply to Muslims. The law particularly is expanded to include Christians and Jews, because particularly in some branches of Judaism, for any of those types of issues, you have to go to a rabbi and get their input and their view on what's going on. It's the 1925 Federal Arbitration Act. It allows Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others to use religious tribunals to arbitrate disagreements, and the judgments that result are given the force of law by state and federal courts. It specifically preempts inconsistent state legislation. So all of these efforts to ban Sharia law are already preempted by a federal ruling. And this isn't a bad thing, because this isn't saying that women are going to be stoned to death for being raped. This isn't saying that thieves are going to have their hands cut off. It's saying that if you as a religious person want to go to a religious body to resolve your lawsuit, the government will respect that desire, and their ruling will be upheld. And this, again, it's not a unique protection. This is something that can be consented to if people want to go to into arbitration instead of going to court. It's been upheld as constitutional. So the Southland Court versus Keating applies where and I don't really want to see this overruled. I like the idea that people are entitled to, if everybody agrees, you can go have a group of rabbis or a group of Catholic priests or Islamic scholars or some other religious body make the decision. It's not an enforcement of religious rule on people. It's offering a religious option. Are there more extreme sects of Islam that want to see the more extreme examples of Sharia law enforced in the United States? Yes, there are. There's no denying that. Just as there are Christian sects that think that women should be required to wear skirts instead of pants, and other, there are even some extremists in Christianity that think, we should send homosexuals off to concentration camps. And I think even most Christians that consider homosexuality sinful think that sending them to internment camps or re-education camps is probably a little extreme. The reality is there are millions of Muslims living in the United States that are in fact integrating with our culture, that do speak out when terrorist actions happen, and treating them as criminals or second-class citizens just because of their religion, not because of crimes they've actually committed, is not fair. So I think I'm getting towards the end of a discussion of Islam. It's by no means complete. There's so much more I can get into with their theology and their beliefs, and it's really quite fascinating. And I'll get into it a little. So Islam, one of the many things I find interesting in Islam is there are a lot of beliefs that are very similar to Jewish and Christian beliefs. The idea of the creation. They believe man was created from a clot of blood. They believe in the garden. They believe in one God. They believe in angels. What I find, one of the things I find interesting is there were three major beings created by Allah in Islam. There are man, angels, and jinn. What makes angels in Islam are not different from Christian and Jewish angels, and in fact they share some of the same angels. As I said, the Archangel Gabriel is supposed to have been the one to deliver the Qu'ran. Michael is another important angel in their religion. But what makes their idea of angels different and interesting, in my opinion, is angels in Islam have no free will. There for the most part, and there are sects that disagree with this, there are no such thing as fallen angels. What we would think of as demons are the jinn, are some of the jinn, because not all the jinn are evil either, because the jinn have free will, just as man does. So Allah creates angels, creates jinn, creates man. He tells the angels and the jinn that they are to bow before man. The angels do because, again, no free will. Some of the jinn refuse. And their reasons aren't inherently malevolent. In point of fact, they refuse because they believe that they should bow before no one but Allah, no one but before. You'll see this in a lot of things about demons sometimes, where it was their refusal to recognize the supremacy of man that caused the fall. But a group of jinn, to a point, rebel, and that's... Hold on. I think okay, it looked like the stream died for a second, hopefully, but and that's where their equivalent of demons comes from. And I find that a very interesting concept. I'm not sure I agree or disagree with it. And it goes into what I've discussed in past episodes about the origins of the idea. Where do demons come from? One of the other interesting groups I forgot to mention. They're not nearly as big a group, which is why the two major sects are Sunni and Shiite. There's also the Sufi, which are mystics. The term mystic gets misused a lot. But in this sense, and for that matter, Christian mystics and Jewish mystics, in a more proper historical context, what a mystic is a person. When we pray, most people believe when they pray they're talking to God. Mystics are people that believe that God talks back. And it's a much more personal relationship with the Creator than traditional religious thought, which is where the Sufi fall in. But no discussion of Islam is complete, I think, without acknowledging some of the darker side of their history. And of course, there are plenty of people out there that are going to be angry if I don't address the terroristic attacks that have been done by Al Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups like them. So historically speaking, when a lot of people think of Christian extremism historically, the Crusades is a pretty common topic. But the history of the Crusades are complicated. And what you run into is, yes, Christians invaded the Holy Land and fought the Muslims. The Muslims invaded Europe. They invaded Europe before the Crusades. They invaded Europe after the Crusades. Now, across the board, how they treated conquered people ran the gambit. Sometimes they were actually fairly fair and reasonable with people. Particularly because in aspects of Islamic law, you can be Christian or Jewish and live in an Islamic city. You have to pay a tax, and you're not allowed to openly practice your religion. But as long as you pay the tax and you keep it to yourself, there's a concept that seems fairly common in various Islamic schools of thought on law, that law is primarily concerned with particularly the punishment side of law is concerned with public behavior. If you want to sit at home and pray, they're not going to bust down your door. It's if you're trying to convert, particularly if you're trying to convert Muslims, or if you have a church, that the law may get involved, and that depends heavily on which country you're talking about, which sect you're talking about, how extreme the people in question are. There's an example that there are examples of Christian churches that have existed reasonably peacefully, as well as ones that were attacked. No religion's history is cut and dried good and evil. People who say that it is are being overly simplistic. The Muslims didn't invade Europe. They did do some terrible things. Christians did some terrible things back to them. And some of it was justified, and some of it was actually response to aggression from one side or the other. And I'm going to get into it after this, but people think, what has Islam done for the world? There's actually some really important inventions and innovations that trace their roots back to Muslim countries, and we're going to get into that too. But that's kind of the thing you run into. Another group historically that I find very interesting is the Hashashin, which is where we get the word assassin. What I find interesting, having done a little research on this last night, is people tend to think the usual explanation of the name Hashashin is from the drug hashish. And hashish is a derivative of marijuana that they smoked before going into battle. But they were an Islamic sect of warriors founded in the 11th century. From a branch, a split Ismailism, which itself is a branch of the Shiite religion. They were actually primarily, especially certain video games like, I don't know, Assassin's Creed, depict them as the enemies of the Templars. Actually, originally, historically, they had more issues with the Sunnis. Remember what I said earlier about a lot of the conflict is actually between the various sects of Islam, not between Muslims and non-Muslims. In fact, as I understand it, there are a number of times when the Hashashin worked with the Templars against the Sunnis because they saw it as a common foe. Also, they get demonized fairly unreasonably. In general, they aren't quite the noble saints that they're implied to be in the Assassin's Creed games, but they weren't exactly monsters either. And again, they're very. That's kind of the thing is, I'm hitting on so many topics that are so incredibly interesting, and there's so much information out there. We could be going for hours on one of the. I could do a dozen shows or more on jihad. I could do a dozen shows or more on Sharia law. I could do a dozen shows or more on the history. And perhaps down the road I'll try and revisit some of these topics in greater detail. But I'm trying to do a broader overview. That's kind of an issue. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Islamic extremism today. There's no denying that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have done terrible things. Probably all of my listeners are acutely aware of 9/11. I'm not going to try to justify what happened there. No one can. What's important to realize, though, what's critical to realize, though, is Al-Qaeda and ISIS and groups of that nature do not represent the whole of the religion. I've heard said many, many times that if the Muslims didn't approve of the 9/11 attack and the various other terrorist attacks, why didn't they speak about it? So I did a search online. And I have a couple of quotes I want to read here. Rashid Ghanouchi, the leader of Tanzania's Ennahda party, along with other leaders, Mustafa Mashur, General Guide, Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt, Qazi Hussein Ahmed Amir, Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan, Mudi Rahman Nizami Amir. This is a joint statement by over 40 Muslim scholars and politicians. The undersigned leaders of the Islamic movements are horrified by the events of Tuesday, 11 September 2001 in the United States, which resulted in the massive killing, destruction, and attack on innocent lives. We express our deepest sympathies and sorrow. We condemn in the strongest terms the incidents which are against all human and Islamic norms. This is grounded in the noble laws of Islam, which forbid all forms of attacks on innocents. God Almighty says in the Holy Qu'ran, no bearer of burdens can bear the burden of another. Surah Al-Isra 17:15. There's a fatwa by Sheikh Yusuf Qardawi. Again, I apologize for my butchering of pronunciations. The Grand Islamic scholar and chairman of the Sunnah and Syria Council Qatar et al. All Muslims ought to be united against all those who terrorize the innocents and those who permit the killing of non-combatants without a justifiable reason. Islam has declared the spilling of blood and the destruction of property as absolute prohibitions until the day of judgment. God, glory be to He, said, because of that we ordained unto the children of Israel that if anyone killed a human being, unless it be in punishment for murder or for spreading of mischief on earth, it would be as though he killed all of humanity. Whereas if anyone saved a life, it would be as though he saved the life of all of humanity. Qu'ran 5:32. Sheikh Mohammed Sayyid al-Tantawi, Imam of Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, Egypt. Attacking innocent people is not courageous. It is stupid and will be punished on the day of judgment. It's not courageous to attack innocent children, women, and civilians. It is courageous to protect freedom. It is courageous to defend oneself and not to attack. Statement from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We strongly condemn such activities that are against all humanist and Islamic morals. We condemn and oppose all aggression to human life, freedom, and dignity everywhere in the world. And you can find these kind of statements after every one of the major terrorist attacks by Islamic extremists. There are extremists in Islam. There is no denying that. There are Islamic countries in the world that enforce unfair sexist laws that demean women, that torture and kill people for unreasonable reasons. I am not in any way condoning any of these actions, but there are 1.1 billion Muslims in the world. There are millions of them here in the United States. Most of these people are not terrorists. Most of these people are not cutting people's heads off. Most of these people are reasonable people trying to get along the world like the rest of us. I am not by any means telling people that you're not entitled to disagree with Islamic belief. I have, I'll get into what my personal disagreement with Islam as a religion. And to be clear, this is not a moral judgment of Islam in any way. But this is a fundamental difference between my beliefs as a Christian and Islamic beliefs that is based on Quranic teachings. Islam says that Jesus was a prophet. There's a great deal of respect for Jesus in Islam, but he's a prophet. He is not part of God. He is not. He may or may not be the Messiah, depending on which branch of Islam you got. But he's not divine. He's only a prophet. The Quran also teaches that he did not die on the cross. As a Christian, I disagree with these beliefs. Because it's contrary to my own beliefs on the subject. I do not think this makes Muslims evil people. It's a theological disagreement. I have a theological disagreement with Jews who believe Jesus may have been a great teacher or possibly a prophet, but he was not Messiah. I am not condemning these people for holding a different religious viewpoint than my own. I absolutely and without reservation condemn those who commit acts of violence in the name of God, whatever name they choose to give God. But I encourage people to educate them. And the point of this series, again, is education. The point of this series is to point out what people actually believe and that things aren't as and particularly the reason I'm talking about the realities of the Ottomans and the terrorist attacks is I don't want to sugarcoat things. I don't want to pretend that there aren't extremists and nutcases in these religions, because there are. But the thing is, as you'll see as I look at them, There are extremists in a variety of religions. If you want an example, for example, in Judaism, there are entire cultures and societies that we only know about because the Bible talks about the Jews going to war with and wiping them out. I am not condemning. I am not trying to condemn or call wicked or otherwise demean the beliefs of other people. I am trying to make people more aware of what those beliefs actually are and to encourage people to do their own research and educate themselves using unbiased sources. Don't rely on, when I was doing the research for this article, there are so many websites telling me how horrible and evil Muslims are, and it's like, but they use deceptive tactics. You'll see some of these websites make up quotes from the Quran, or they take things out of context. And yeah, there are which isn't to say there are no quotes in the Quran or the Bible or any other holy text that can be interpreted in horrible ways. There are, but the religion as a whole is not inherently violent, destructive, or evil. To end things on a positive note, let's talk about some of the impact Islam has had on the world that is positive, because there are ways that Islam has affected the Western world that's important scientifically, mathematically. I want to drive home my point by pointing out the other good thing, that there are the good things that they've done. Because there are good things they've done. There are important things they've done. And that they continue to do. You cannot condemn an entire people based on the actions of lunatics and extremists, whose actions are primarily politically motivated, not religiously motivated. But just to give you an idea of some of the things, Ibn Sina, who was a Persian intellectual in 980 to 1037 AD, C or AD as you prefer. Known as Avicenna of the West, he made great contributions to philosophy, mathematics, and particularly to medicine. His Arabic book, The Canon of Medicine, was so influential it was used by doctors and students of medicine for hundreds of years. He describes how to properly quarantine patients to avoid the spreading of illness. He provides criteria for properly testing medicine. In the Middle Ages, Muslim doctors were the first to use anatomy, or antimony, which is a metalloid, for medicinal powers. Hospitals were developed by the Muslims. Surgical practices that were shunned by other societies were further explored and developed in the Islamic world. Some of their ideas about evolution before prayer helped expand our understandings of hygiene. They had a large impact in the development of algebra, for goodness sakes. There's also a reason why the numbers that we use in the English language are known as Arabic numerals. Muslims are a society. Islam is a religion like any other. Arabic society is a culture like any other. It has its heights, it has its lows. There is good and there is evil in these concepts, just as there is good and evil in people. I encourage people to educate themselves as objectively as possible and come to their own conclusions instead of rushing to judgment based on extremists. As a Christian, I would not want to be judged by the actions of Westboro Baptist Church. I would not want to be judged by the actions of members of the Ku Klux Klan that claim to be Christian. Muslims don't want to be judged. Most Muslims don't want to be judged by the actions of ISIS and Al Qaeda. And again, personally, I have made a hobby of studying religion for 20 years. I find it absolutely fascinating. And that's true of Islam as well as the other religions I'm going to be talking about. And in other religions, I may not touch upon this directly. I encourage people to study it. It is an interesting look into human psyche and the way that people try to answer questions we all have. I want to thank everybody for listening. I've had people popping in or out all night. I will be putting up a number of links in the description to Harvard's website on Sharia law. I'm going to put links to religious tolerances pages over and a few other good pages I found over, giving you a broad overview of Islam. I'm going to put links to pages that have quotations from various Islamic leaders condemning terrorist attacks. I encourage everyone listening who's put up with me for the last almost 2 hours to research it, look at what I'm putting up, find other sources, educate yourself, and make your own conclusion. I have said many times, and I stand by, I believe in the intelligence of the people that listen to me. I appreciate the support of the people that listen to me. And I think that the people out there, especially people that are willing to listen to sit here and listen to me talk about religion for nearly 2 hours, are willing to take the time and make the effort to educate themselves on these subjects, and I encourage you to do so. I'm going to be wrapping it up for tonight. Thank you all for listening. Tune in next week. We're going to be tackling Judaism and Christianity. For those of you who are already annoyed with this whole journey through religion, I will be getting back to other topics once this is over. But this is something very important to me. I am looking into people to interview and things of that nature, so do stick around. It's my hope I haven't angered anybody by trying to present Islam objectively. But I have no patience or tolerance for hate. If there are any Muslims who watch this who think I screwed up, please correct me. I will try. Please give me, and I'm not going to ask for sources because I don't necessarily believe you, but I want to educate myself further. So please provide sources where I can research your points further. If there are any Muslim clerics out there that are so inclined, I would be more than happy to have you on as a guest so that you can talk about your religion for yourself. I do welcome criticism from anyone, as always, Christian, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, whatever. You're welcome to criticize me in the comments. You are welcome to email me at kevinm.paranormalencyclopedia@gmail.com if you want to talk to me directly. I do both check comments regularly, and I do check my email on a daily basis. The only standard I have with all of this is be aware I do monitor comments. If you get rude, if you get disrespectful, if you get insulting and demeaning, I'm gonna cut you off. Don't call, be better than that. Don't call people names. Don't insult people. Don't condemn people. Keep it civil. That's all I ask. This is it for tonight. I want to thank everyone again for watching. This is your host, Kevin Mears. Have a good night and God bless.